Sup, y'all? Matt Garska here. Oh. Sup, y'all? I'm back. I'm gonna answer some more questions that I've received through my website. Usually I don't have time to dive into detail for your inquiries, but yeah, I have some time now, and I sent out an email asking for people's questions, but yeah, I got way more than I needed or thought that I would have, so yep. Round two. Let's get started here. The first one is from Philip. He says, "Hi, Matt Garska. Thank you for being one of the most influential drummers in my life. It caught my attention when I bought your drum scores, and your solos and fills are laid out and written well. Do you always write down your fills and solos? I've tried to do it myself on other songs, but it ended up not being so musical. Any tips? I know a written fill has the advantage of being able to repeat it precisely over and over again. But if the case is that I have to play a song or something at an instant, how would you approach playing fills or solos in this situation?" So, yeah, I would say, first of all, there's not a single process that I go through. There's many different processes, and fills are often improvised, but I often build fills as well and try to craft dope ass fills, and that's just comes from working on patterns on the drum kit. It comes from vocabulary, so kind of melding those two, and yeah, I think both go hand in hand. When you craft fills, the more that you do that, and not necessarily write them out, but have them preordained, then that helps to refine your vocabulary, and that ends up coming out in your improvisation. So it improves your improv. Yeah, I mean, I transcribe all my performances after the fact. So I transcribed the Joy of Motion album. I transcribed the Madness of Many album, the Victoria album, Modern Value. There's some other singles that I've transcribed, but it's usually after the fact. And I am programming when Animals is doing our demos. So that requires knowing every single note, just as I might as well be writing it out. So yeah, like sometimes I'm programming on the computer, and sometimes it's on an e-kit. So basically, it's kind of a mesh of those two. Yeah, some performances are completely improvised, like the solos. All the solos, like the one in Inner Assassins, the one in Ectogenesis, those are completely improvised. And I just come up with a bunch of different patterns over those vamps and, try to build a massive network that I can float around in. But that requires an extreme excess of time to build a framework in which you can work in and around. So, yep. All right. Mario from Chile. I would like to know the pattern/sticking on the ride cymbal in the song Cognitive Contortions at 2 minutes and 38 seconds. This is a really simple pattern. It's just a bell with the shank of the stick on every downbeat, and the anda is on the tip of the stick and the bow of the cymbal. So 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a ting to the ting to the ting to the. It's a cowbell pattern, basically, that's applied to the ride. Alan says, my question is about how you approach drumming fitness and nutrition. I remember watching you use battle ropes. Do you believe in the importance of warming up and stretching? If so, what routines do you have for this before and after playing? What types of things do you incorporate to your training away from the drum set that makes you a beast on the drums that you are? Well, yeah, I'd lift weights, but I would say they aren't the most lateral form of exercise for drumming, because it's, I guess, slow movements, moving heavy weight, and drumming is more cardio driven, I guess. I do see an uptick in performance the day of lifting weights. So I'd say I lifted weights this morning. When I go to practice, I could, because of the blood flow, everything's warmed up, I'm just ready to go and feeling like I'm on a physical peak. But the backlash from that can be pretty serious, like 2 days later. Super sore, or the next day I have a lot of inflammation in my hands. So it's not it's not the best, but it also helps not to do crazy metabolic work like CrossFit or something like that. That is so demanding that metabolically, that it just steals away nutrition from my brain, nutrients from my blood, and yeah, I guess my cells in general, I don't know, man. I'll do like a 20-30 minute AMRAP, and really as many rounds as possible, pushing it to the brink, and I'll be basically useless the rest of the day and deal with, get some serious brain fog. So I kind of stopped that style. The battle ropes are the most lateral. They are, you're moving your arms like this. It's most like drumming. It's cardio, but it'll also get you a serious pump. As far as nutrition goes, yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to eat healthy, and supplements like cordyceps, I use those. Brain supplements too. I like, there's a bunch of different ones. Rhodiola, there's Alpha Brain. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff supplements that I take to try to improve performance. So I'm always interested in optimizing. And yeah, yoga as well. Yoga is really good for someone else asked a question about yoga, and I used to do it back in my Berkeley days, and it actually helped stave off injuries and carpal tunnel issues. So I think weightlifting and yoga go really hand in hand, and those kind of keep from, like, the weightlifting will make you too stiff, and the yoga keeps that from impacting your drumming, so, or at least mine. So yeah, a balanced fitness plan. Here's the next question. How do you decide what you are going to practice, and what do you do to retain as much of the information as possible? Well, retaining information is a brain function, and you need sleep to compress the memories that you have made throughout the day. So sleep is absolutely imperative. And so is frequency, consistency. Basically, how often are you recalling this information? And I'd say another thing is knowing what phase you're in. So are you in a amassing phase? At Berkeley, I was in an amassing phase where I was just trying to build as much as possible. And from that, it's kind of like getting bulky and then cutting down. So you amass a bunch of new skill sets, and then you start pruning and getting focused on what you want to pinpoint as your choices of what you want to play, basically. Yeah, also being able to apply these different concepts in different contexts is going to help solidify what skills you have acquired. And that's something that I overlooked at that time. Like doing projects and actually applying the knowledge that I was gaining in the skill sets was actually really important. Barath says, personally, having played and learned under a tutor for many years, I find it very hard to teach myself / discover new stuff by myself to keep learning and grow as a musician. How does one learn to be a self-taught musician? I ain't the one to ask, bro. I started when I was 8, and my dad got me lessons at that time. So I'm not a self-taught musician. I teach myself regularly with the knowledge I've already acquired, with what I've been taught by my teachers. But yeah, I think it's also a sense of curiosity and being obsessive enough to investigate and try to get to the bottom of the questions you pose. And that's kind of, I think, that's the curiosities. What questions are you posing? Like, what happens if I put this pattern over this pattern? What happens if I that permutating thing that I heard about where you move everything over 1/16th note, what would happen there? Like, just posing those questions and investigating, seeing what it sounds like. Okay, next one. I'm currently struggling with foot patterns being perfectly tight for the woven web. Could you give advice on practice strategies to use to overcome technical roadblocks quickly and completely with specific skill sets in a song? Also, could you give advice on your approach to efficiently building a very personal, fluid vocabulary? Okay. The woven web is not an easy double bass pattern, and it requires a lot of facility to pull off cleanly. And that's basically my advice. When you're experiencing a serious technical roadblock, you can't just look at it as if that one part is your problem. You have to look at it completely, like nutrition, a complete, supplementation of what you're trying to accomplish. That's kind of the way I look at it. I work on a bunch of different double bass patterns if I'm experiencing trouble in the woven web pattern, because you can play that pattern a million times, but it will never get past a level of cleanliness if you don't have a solid foundation. So that kind of goes with a lot of these tunes, is like I see people trying to play them and it's really above their pay grade, so to speak, where they don't have the facility to be playing that pattern, but because they played it 1,000 times, they are able to just barely pull it off, but it's not clean. So I take a holistic approach to these patterns, and it's definitely more time consuming because it means, yeah, you're still gonna have to play the pattern 1,000 times, work for how many ever hours, but you're gonna have to do a bunch of other work too. But you'll come out the other side being able to handle those complex patterns better. If you only work on the woven web pattern, then you're not gaining a whole lot of ability to be able to learn new double bass patterns or execute challenging double bass patterns. It's only one. So, all right, the other part of his question is also, could you give advice on your approach to efficiently building a very personal, fluid vocabulary? So I guess I'll have to unpack those different words he's using. Fluid, familiarity breeds fluency. So the more times you play a pattern, the more ingrained it is in your brain. And think of your neurons like becoming fiber optic cables, and that connection to that pattern becomes more solid. It's faster. Your recall of that pattern, your ability to execute it, is faster. So you have to play 1,000 patterns 1,000 times instead of 1,000,000 patterns one time each. So that's where the fluidity comes into play. The personal element has to do with what patterns and phrases tend to interest you, and that's ultimately your choice. It's going to be stylistic. Each style has its own vocabulary, so yeah, it's what you choose and what you tend to choose over long periods of time. As far as vocabulary, I've always wanted a massive vocabulary. I always wanted an excess of things to say on the drums, which requires an excess of time to build that vocabulary, that range and variety of vocabulary. So you have kind of a choice. You can take longer and build a larger vocabulary, or kind of narrow down your vocabulary, and you'll achieve a fluid vocabulary faster, but it will be more limited. So, that's not something I personally recommend because that's not my style. Alex says, how did you compose Arithmophobia? Were you jamming with patterns, or were you thinking of a melody, or was it a mutation from an exercise? Or how? I wrote these different sections at different times, but they're all kind of based around the same idea, which is to have phrases that take a long time to resolve that are still in 4/4. It's just a lot of collection of odd groupings that it takes 8 bars of 16th notes to resolve. I don't know, I came up with a bunch of those patterns on the road. A lot of them were sticking based. They came from stickings, but it was also me trying to hear those patterns over the bar line, way over the bar line, and stretch my ear to be able to stay grounded in 4/4. So yeah, try to listen to that song as if it were in 4/4. Maybe put it in a slow down app or something and count 16th notes. That's the idea behind it. So, and then the guys wrote a bunch of patterns to that. So Hi Matt, I'm George. I'm using Iron Cobra Roll and Glide pedals like you, and these are my first pedals. I don't understand your technique. How do you play on this? What muscles do you use? And Lippincott, in the end, you play very fast. But don't you relax your muscles? For example, in Backpfeifengesicht, you play also very fast. This is a great question for me, but an equally great question is the settings of your pedals. What spring do you use? What is your beater angle? How far is it extended? Tell it all, please. All right, I have my tension super low, and that's because I don't understand why I would put my tension super high, resisting me from getting the beater to the head. I'm not the fastest guy in the world, so maybe, I'm not a death metal guy, so maybe don't listen to that, but I do utilize the rebound. When I'm playing at fast tempos, I'm not sticking the beater. There's no time to stick the beater. So I have them loose. The spring tension it's enough to where that and the rebound gets it back in an adequate enough time. I also have the beaters pretty extended, so that probably delays it getting from the back position to the head, but it creates a whipping technique which creates more power. I'm not about to lose power. Like, I would never get an access pedal because those things have zero power no matter how hard you stomp on them. So me personally, I don't need a great amount of speed. I don't need to play at 200 BPM. The Lippincott section is 208 BPM, and that's like only for like 3 measures of 4/4 or something like that. It's a really small burst, and that's about as fast as I can go, for as long as I can go. So my gig doesn't require a crazy amount of speed to be upkept. So it works for me, man, and I need to be able to stomp on my kick. I need to be able to play powerfully. And, I don't need triggers. I hate triggers. But, if you compress the fuck out of the kick, then it pretty much evens out any inconsistencies. So that's my pedal one. Alice says, could you please talk about how you go about finding the zone when you play, aka from an inspired place, and if there are some things that you worked on that help you get there? The zone can be very elusive. It's almost as if we have no control over when it hits. Not no control, but yeah, I have to plan as if I expect it not to hit. And that's usually when it decides to hit. So when you're just actually thinking about the music and getting into it, really, if you're in your own head and you're thinking about what people think, or if you're gonna nail the next part, then that can really take you out of the zone. Just plan as if you expect it not to hit with your practice. But yeah, when playing with badass musicians, that will certainly inspire me and put me in the zone. Just like playing with musicians that I'm not stoked to play with can take me out of the zone and make me feel like nothing I'm playing is right. Being in the zone can be triggered by an excess of creative energy. So, like filling this cup, all right? If I don't play for a day, I will have some pent-up energy. And when I go to play next, I will be able to unleash excess of creative energy. And if I've been listening to a bunch of music, I've been inspired, that will also come through. But in my younger years, I would not take a day off. It was like once a year or something. It was probably not the best, but for that time, I was trying to just amass a bunch of skill sets. So it made sense at that time because I was less reliant upon creative energy. Nowadays, it makes more sense for me to take a day or two off and come back with a fresh outlook and mindset and fresh ideas. So that can also be dangerous too, is thinking, okay, if I just give it a break and not play for a day or two, then I'll come back and I'll be really killing. That can backfire on you too. So you got to be careful how often you're utilizing that tool. It's a tool meant to be, not playing for a day is a tool that is meant to be used sparingly. And oftentimes we can't control that, but if you are in a position where you can control that, use it. I use it when I go in the studio, usually the day before. I don't do much more than just like some maintenance practice. I might do like an hour and a half, not much, because I want to be super fresh the next day. So yeah, if you're starting out, you're in your first 5 or 10 years, taking days off is probably not a good idea. All right, Arthur says, what exercises will help me develop the hands and feet to learn how to play gospel chops? All right, gospel chops is not binary. All right, rudiments, hand rudiments are binary because there's 2 options. When you're playing a full kit, there's 4 options, and so usually you're dealing with 4-way, often 3-way coordination. The kick is really interspliced in a bunch of those patterns. So start simple. Kick and those are like your 3-way coordination rudiments. Think of them that way. Your foundational patterns, simple, 1 hand, 2 feet. And you learn different little isms or little orchestrations rather. So, if your left hand is playing that, then your right hand can go with the kick. That was one of the first gospel chop patterns that I learned. And there's that. There's 1 hand, 1 foot. You can. If you're going between your floor tom and your right kick, your left hand is free to play patterns over that. So kind of taking these really simple patterns that have the kick spliced in there and working on those and conjuring up a bunch of different variations, and then reflecting and being like, video yourself, listen back and say, okay, I like this pattern, I like that one. That's a very crucial part of the process. But it's also a crucial part of the process to make sure that you're not just playing patterns like rudiments. You're not just playing them dry, that you're actually thinking of musical phrases. Craft those simple patterns, learn how to craft those to musical phrases, into music. So that whenever you're playing those patterns, they're not dry of musical statement, Zimowit says, how to practice. What is the way of building completely new skill / pattern / groove? He's got a bunch of other questions here. Let's handle them one at a time. So this first one, how to completely build a new skill, pattern, groove. You have to be thorough. You have to be very good at You have to get very good at being thorough. And if you want to build a skill completely, you have to be pretty committed to it. And to get it fully embedded in your playing and for it to stick, you have to create several more steps than you think you should take. So think baby steps. I do this to myself all the time. I basically hold myself back from achieving the goal. And the way I kind of think about it is almost like an insurance policy. It's like I want to be successful in embedding this pattern into my being. So to do that, I'm gonna take extra precautions and steps to make sure that this is built into my foundation, so that when I actually get to the other side to look back and say, oh, did that work? Then I can say yes. So it's like an insurance policy. Think high success rate. You want your endeavors to have high success. So you be thorough and create more steps than you need. He says, I wonder how muscle memory works. How long should I play a particular exercise? 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes? The way that I build it up is by making a considerable upfront investment and then trying to coast or cruise after that. So you're learning the pattern, work on it an hour or two a day, something serious for maybe just a few days. It depends on your learning curve. But there's an initial upfront investment, and then you try to coast from there. And of course, you're not going to work on that pattern for the rest of your life, 10 minutes a day for the rest of your life. So you cycle through patterns. And that's also another way to keep things fresh. Your body needs to experience changes. You can't just, like when you're working out, you can't just do the same routine all the time and expect your body to keep giving that response. And that actually happens to lifters. They get in a rut because of that. So it helps to change up your routine. And so cycling through these patterns, give it a month or two that you're really into it, and then maybe a few months later you circle back around and you're like, oh yeah, those patterns that I was really into, let me brush up on those, get those back up to snuff. He says, I'm now about practicing slow, but what is most effective? Play slow for a long period of time without speed up, or start with slow and push forward as my hands burn? Start with slow, and don't speed up gradually. That is not something you want to embed into your brain, because then you'll be playing with people and you start speeding up without knowing it. So don't do that. But maybe he's talking about starting slow, upping the tempo. Really, you have to go by feel. You have to go by when you're playing effortlessly. And I kind of look at it as a spectrum. And, you start on the lower, as low as you can go in the spectrum. Sometimes playing too slow will mess you up and disorient you. To what are upbeats and downbeats, things feel completely different. So sometimes you can't play the slowest tempo. So basically find a place that you are comfortable and work out from there. Work backwards. So slow things down and from there, and then speed up. So like you're trying to slingshot forward, basically, is what you're doing. And trust me, that's more effective. That being said, sometimes I do have the tendency, I've built this in to my natural tendency so much. Sometimes I will play things slower for longer than I need to. And I feel like it kind of keeps me from pushing forward. But that's an extreme case, I think. I think most people are not that. And that took years for me to get to that point where I was like, okay, maybe I'm slowing down too much too often, and it's affecting my, ability to slingshot forward. So, if you're feeling, this is what I've noticed, if you're feeling like your hands are ready to really move at that faster speed and you're capable of doing it, move up, play that, but video yourself, make sure you're actually playing it clean. Don't just say, oh, well, it feels good, so, I can play it at that speed now. It's like you might just be experiencing a temporary boost. So make sure that you're really building your foundation solidly and that you're filling in that spectrum. He says many top drummers don't like to answer the questions like this because they don't want to reveal kind of secret. Maybe you can tell me how you achieved the speed of your singles on a drum set. It was a long practice and only this, or what? So for me, speed comes from technique. I'm not athletically gifted. I'm not an athlete. So for me, it was just about really knowing the patterns, spending a lot of time getting very familiar with the patterns on the kit and developing economic ways to move around the kit. Like, for instance, if I'm moving up the toms, I don't want to be leading with my right hand. I want to be leading with my left. If I'm going around the toms this way, I'm leading with my right. So my kit mobility pack has that in there. The speedy singles section is all about basically different motions around the kit. And those patterns are extremely useful in achieving speed, as well as just, you got to work on technique, man, and smooth that out. And the speed will come. Over time, it will come. They did an experiment where they took people off the street, put them on a piano. They had no prior training, and they said, play as fast as you can. And they recorded, and they took, they had some MIDI attached to it to where they can clock and say, okay, in those 30 seconds or minute, they played at this speed. And then they took some of the best piano players in the world, concert pianists, and had them play extremely fast. It was the same speed. It's like, you're shitting me. The same speed. It's just the professional had control. That was the only real difference. So I have seen this sometimes where students come in, kids, and they're just like, they can play fast, but it doesn't sound as clean, as consistent. So cleanliness, like good, consistency, and power too. Power makes things feel like they're faster than they are. If is gonna feel like it's faster than just really lightly on some jazz toms. So it's perception. Mikola says, I'm really curious about writing songs process in AAL. How does it look like? How do you guys come up with many of the things you play? Just jamming, or is it maybe more like work through computer? For example, you come up with some patterns and send it to the rest. For instance, Rhythmophobia seems to be like a song where drums were created primarily and then added guitars to that. Well, you are correct, sir. That's what Arithmophobia is, but Arithmophobia is the exception. Usually, Tosin's coming up with the first riff, and from there, me and Javier are building around that. But it is in the box. It is that's the term us professionals use when referring to using a DAW, which is a musical computer program. So yeah, it is in the box. That sucks for me, mostly because I'm not actually playing my instrument. I'm either programming or playing on a little E-kit and then trying to make it sound like me on the drums for the demos, and then I get to record real drums in the studio, and that's really the most fun part. But yeah, that's basically the writing process for us. It primarily starts with Tosin, and me and Javier build from around that. Chris says, your technical abilities and coordination are amazing. What are you currently working on from a technical standpoint? When will you put out another Metal Matt video wherein you bench press your bass drum? I don't know, man. Metal Matt, he'll return eventually. But what am I working on right now? I got these single patterns that single stroke roll patterns that are different rates, and they are usually symmetrical, and they lead with different hands. So that's basically the foundation of all of those patterns. I can't divulge them because they are like in the birthing process. So I'm working on those and applying those to the kit. I did just work on them on pads for, a week and a half. And slowly I'm starting to try to apply those to the kit. And now I'm also applying them to the feet, which is another thing I've been working on in general, is trying to play more complex double kick patterns and build a serious foundation and play those patterns clean. So that, I'm always working on quintuplets, septuplets, and non-tuplet patterns, trying to squeeze those in. Hand speed, that's been another thing that I've been working on lately, is trying to get my hands faster. And instead of building speed the way that I did before, which was all through control, I'm actually trying now to, instead of training speed for like an hour and just playing at my cruise tempo or whatever, I'm just going and sprinting, basically, just as fast as I can play. When I feel like it, I go for it and burn myself out as quick as I possibly can. So, I don't recommend this for beginners. I think the best way to build speed is definitely through consistency and building it slow first. But I'm to a point where I'm seeing diminishing returns on that. And it's probably just because I need to switch things up and take a different approach. So that's what I'm doing. And it's an experiment, and maybe it'll make me more sloppy, and it will backfire into my face, but we'll figure it out. I'm also working on putting avant-garde combinations together, so trying to just like painting on the kit, a lot of it's visual, where, would I hit a crash with the left hand and then do a roll on the snare, and just moves that I think are very uncommon. I'm trying to make those common practice in my playing. So that's what I'm working on. All right, August says, I've been dealing with negative thoughts like comparing myself to other drummers, being too judgmental about myself, etc. I think we're in a difficult time where While there are many motivational players out there, it's easy to lose sight of what's important and get into the negative headspace. What are some ways you might go about dealing with those kinds of thoughts? And do you have any tips for keeping yourself in a more positive headspace? I'm not immune to this. Maybe there are people out there that are just immune to it. They don't think about it. And that's probably their strength. That's kind of what you have to do, is try to not think about comparing yourself to where others are, and just focus on what you need and your practice regimen to improve. And it doesn't mean that you can't look at those other players and say that's killing, that's sick. I want that. Like, that should be your reaction, is to want to acquire that skill. So just, maybe take some space and reassess what your focuses are, and then plan and come up with a solution for a genius solution for how you are going to achieve those goals you set out. And that will help quell your anxiety. Sitting and sulking will not. And thinking about how you're not as good as them, you won't be, despairing, basically. That will not help you. So, although I've done it, I'm not immune to it. Like I said, it's happened to me. I've festered before and been like, damn, I really sucked, or this person's really fucking kicking my ass. Yeah, it happens. But it's important to remember what you love most and the reason why you got into drumming, and try to use it for a de-stressor. Use it as meditation. Try not to get in your own head and put it on paper. Put your plan on paper and start executing it. How do you keep your passion in drumming or music industry when you aren't able to break through the level that you are stuck in for a long time? Or when there are a lot of stuff that drags you down, like financial problem? Well, let's start with the first one, the easier one. Plateaus, basically. You're stuck in a plateau. You can either break from the plateau and try to give yourself a fresh outlook when you return, or you can just power through, and that might be solidifying that level that you're at. We think of it as a plateau, like I'm not breaking through the next, I'm not improving. And it's like, well, yeah, you might just be laying more concrete in that foundation so it can withstand more building that you're gonna build on after that. So that's the way that I like to look at it and think of plateaus. It's a solidifying of where you're at. That being said, I do think that breaking can be a useful tool used sparingly. You can come up with creative solutions you otherwise would not have come up with. So that's only to be used for non-beginners. As far as the financial struggles, I mean, that's tough, man. That shit will weigh you down, stress you out. I've been there. You gotta try to use it to motivate you and to push you to work harder and have some faith that doing the right practices will get you to the other side. The breakthrough never comes when you've earned it or when you're ready for it. It's always well after. So that's just a reality of life. Just because you've attained a certain level, just because you've accomplished it, doesn't mean that the world will instantly recognize it. It takes them time, the rest of the world, to see that. So, and to, if you're trying to get a gig, you can't just be, the day that you're ready to play a professional gig and to be on stage and on tour with a big band, that just because that day comes does not mean that it will happen that day. It'll probably take years. So yeah, just use as much logic and planning as you can to try to better your chances. Network as well. You can't just sit in the practice room and wait for your phone to ring. You gotta network and know people. Be patient and change things little by little. Make little improvements. Here's a question I often get. What place do you consider that Berkeley had in your accomplishment as one of the best drummers? How much worth it was it? Was it essential? People often ask, should I go to Berkeley? Should I do it? I think it depends on what type of person you are. For me, it played a huge role, and I would not be the Matt Garska that I am now without Berkeley. Just the amount of knowledge I was able to soak up and amass from the teachers as well as the students was, I don't think there's another place in the world that is that concentrated in superior musicianship and young talent. The environment doesn't get any more immersive. It is insanely expensive now, though. Now it's $65K a year to go there, which means you will have $260,000 worth of student loan debt by the time you graduate, and that doesn't seem worth it. That seems ridiculous. There are a bunch of financial aid. There's grants in place, but still, it's absurd. I don't think it's right. If you're rich, it's fine. It doesn't matter. You can go there just for shits and giggles. But if you're gonna go, then make the absolute most of it. And that's what I did. Not because of the money, really. I honestly didn't know what I was getting myself into as far as debt whenever I signed on for those student loans. But I don't regret it. I was willing to do whatever it took. So that's the price I pay now, and I would do it 100 times over, because that's how much I care about this craft. So depends on the type of person you are. How do you work on eliminating what I call hard drive freezes? These are the moments where your flow is interrupted by that split second of inability, or your idea seems to not quite come together. You see this happen with many drummers, usually followed by an audible "ah" of all skill levels, but I never seem to detect it in your playing. Well, guys, it does happen to me. Definitely not immune to the hard drive freezes. I try to mitigate that by playing things slow and operating at below 100% CPU threshold. I try to keep it between 60 and 80. So if I'm having those moments where I'm freezing, then it means that I need to slow things down and play where I'm actually flowing at, where where I can sustain for a long period of time. It's just like getting on a treadmill. You know, when I get on a treadmill, I want to go fast, but I won't last at that speed. So I'm either doing sprints, or usually what I'm doing in my actual practice is trying to sustain things for long periods of time so I can get as much done as possible, as much workload. And if you're sprinting, that's not the way to do it. So when you get on the treadmill, pick a low speed that you can sustain for 20 to 30 minutes without stopping. And that's kind of the same idea with this. That being said, there's times when I experience zero lag or hard drive freezes, and that's when I'm extremely inspired, and when ideas are just bursting at the seams and I am executing all the ideas precisely no matter what I think of. And it's like I'm almost bearing witness to like an animal just releasing. But you know, that's not it. You can't try to base everything around that, because those moments are fleeting. You know, it's just the laws of nature. You're not going to be able to have those moments all the time. I mean, you can do your best to stay inspired, but for the most part, playing things slowly. I also kind of have an 80-20 rule, where 80% of the time I'm operating at 60 to 80% in my comfort zone, basically, and the zone where I'm actually processing and assimilating the information. If I'm playing too fast to remember anything that I just did, then it's not going to set in the same way. It's not going to sink in. I always compare it to running from a lion. You know, if you're running from a lion, you're in survival mode. Your decision-making skills are flawed, and your recollection of the event will probably be tainted. That's the word I was looking for, tainted. Inaccurate. So 80% of the time, I'm operating in that comfort zone, and then the other 20% of the time, I'm pushing and seeing what the limits are, and not trying to get a hard drive freeze, but seeing if I can push through those moments. That's definitely an element, is that's part of it, learning to push through those moments. But to do that, you have to practice that. There's some cats who never play in the 60-80% rate. They're always playing at 100%. So they get really good at pushing through those moments. But those cats are not as clean. They're not as stable, we'll say. So that's my advice. What have you had to adjust in your practice method / mindset to see the great change in results? Yeah, that's one of those things. I've had to introduce 20% of pushing, because I used to just think of all of it as I'm laying a foundation, always laying the foundation, always laying a foundation, always playing things between 60 to 80%, not ever having those hard drive freezes. And that's good for the most part, but then when you get into situations where you're in a shed or where you're playing with musicians and you have to push, you don't want to be slowing down so that everything's comfortable at that speed. You have to be able to push through those moments. So you have to have an adequate amount of time practicing that. 20%. Pierce says, how does one prevent oneself from getting distracted during practice? Well, I always tried to power through, but eventually I found that taking small breaks was really important. That is super helpful to refreshing your brain, your focus, but also when you're actually practicing, you have to sustain and keep your own interest, which means you have to come up with interesting ideas, like adding dynamics to a part, making a part more melodic by orchestrating it, maybe putting it in a different context, triplets and 16th notes. And of course you can't be changing those things all the time. So those changes have to be frequent enough to keep your attention, yet long enough that you're actually repeating the patterns enough times and embedding it in your consciousness. So, I don't know, each pattern 5 minutes, something like that, 10 minutes. So, I don't know. You have to feel that out when you're really thinking about your laundry and you're not anywhere near, your brain is not anywhere near your actual practice behind your kit. That's the problem. So keep things interesting to try to stay in the zone. It's the zone where you're in like a flow state, where you're just working on the patterns and it's interesting to you, and then an hour, 2 hours goes by like that. So it's my advice. Luke asks, could you talk a little bit about your collaboration process with your side projects like Victoria and Kazimir Libersky? I'd love to hear about the formation and the stories behind these groups. I discovered you through AAL, but have fallen in love with Modern Value and Cosmic Liberty both. Well, with Victoria, me and Josh come up with those ideas, and a lot of times it's based off of like a metric modulation idea. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely the sole composer in that group. With the Kazimir Libersky project, that was all his compositions. I didn't help write those at all. I just put drums to them, and maybe a couple little things were changed, some time signatures, some little beats or whatever, like three extra 16th notes. He'd do weird shit like that, where it's like some of those I was like, I don't know, this is weird. But yeah, by and large, I just put drums to the music, and tried to. A lot of times he'd have some stuff like a 19 pattern, and it was written out as 19, but I didn't want to play it as 19. I'm like, this is not gonna groove the same, so I actually put it under quarter note pulses and had those micro rhythms cycling underneath. So that's one thing I tried to do. Oh, some parts I even metrically modulated and took like 3/5, 3/5, and changed those to 2s and 3s, and it made the part sound like it was at a completely different tempo, but a completely different feel too, which is pretty cool. That song is Cosmic Liberty. It's the title track off of the Kazimir Libersky album, and it's at the 6-minute 45 marker. Just so you guys can look it up, hear what a bunch of 3s and 5s sound like modulating to 2s and 3s, being viewed as triplets. Fun shit. One guy's asking about my unique way of breathing, and does it have to do with my phrasing idea? Man, I'm not conscious enough of my breathing. It's kind of that and my posture. Those are two things that I need to work on. But it's secondary. Sometimes I make noises, man, when I'm playing, and I don't know what's going on, but when I get really into it, these things happen. Like my breathing gets all weird, and I think it's timed with hits and certain phrases and things, and So is my humming, which like there's a noise that I'm making when I'm playing. Sometimes it's like a grunt, sometimes it's a high-pitched noise. I don't have control, man. Not over that. It's just maybe it's shutting down the half of my brain, or half part of my brain. I don't know. Next question. I've been going deep on unifunk and single pedal lesson for a month or so. Love the continuum it creates between Dawson-style jazz and a systematic approach to metal and hip-hop. On that note, how would you recommend structuring a 2-hour daily practice session? Also, how would you recommend beginning to integrate the unifunk coordination exercises into a world music context? Well, I think the unifunk stuff is perfect for world music. How would I start to integrate that? I mean, yeah, start playing the patterns over some world music, seeing how those odd patterns evolve over the bar line. Start matching some of their phrases and taking that idea of having the kicks and the snares having a conversation. That's basically what it's based off of. It helps develop the left hand a lot, and it helps think of those two biggest melodic notes that we have, which is kick and snare. That's the primary driving force of feel for drums. So the left hand and the right foot are, in my opinion, more important of a relationship than the right hand and the left hand. So just foster the relationship of playing phrases back and forth between each other and playing complementing phrases. He also asks, how would you recommend structuring a 2-hour daily practice session? 2 hours, I would say, well, just in general for me, I'd like to do half of my practice as calibrating and technical practice. So it's partially calibrating me for whenever I go to play to music and have fun or work on projects. It's calibrating me so that I'm nice and warmed up, I'm dialed in. But it's also making sure that I'm solidifying my foundation. And I like to do that first. I find the dessert is the musical stuff, and it's easier to play to a click and to play only drums and really focus on your sound and accuracy before playing music. Yeah, kind of like it's hard to eat vegetables after, it's hard to want to eat vegetables after dessert. So that's kind of how I structure things. Nowadays, the calibration gets a little bit dwindled down. Or if I have like 4 to 6 hours, the likelihood that I'm going to spend 2 to 3 hours on facility building and foundational exercises is less likely, if I have a bunch of projects. So that's how things are now. But yeah, back in the day, it was like maybe 75% calibrating and technical facility building. Try that out. Try being conscious of that. All right, Dan has quite a few questions, so I'm going to try to blaze through them. First one is, when working on a concept or technique you know will take many months, perhaps even years to develop the standard that you want, does it remain a mainstay in your practice routine for an indefinite amount of time until you've developed it, or do you bring it in and out? Perhaps practicing it for a month solidly, then taking a couple weeks break from it, then practicing it again for another period of time. Yes, this is what I recommend. I find it very hard to work on straight 16ths in the double bass every single day for years. I've never really done that. You have to have enough. It's just like when I'm talking about when you're actually sitting down and you need to keep things interesting enough for you to stay focused. The same goes for your general practice routine. It has to change often enough to be interesting, and you want to be interested and engaged. This is not bricklaying, you know. Otherwise, you're gonna end up being unmusical. You're gonna be dry, and you might be great technically speaking, but you'll lack soul, bro. So don't sell your soul. Keep things interchanging often enough. Like I said earlier in the video, make an initial upfront investment that is considerable that's kind of your buy-in for the pattern, the thing that you're trying to play and integrate in your playing, and then sustain from there for a few weeks, maybe a few months, if it's really important to you, if it's really something that you think you're going to need long term and that you are committed to long term. And of course, other things will come up and you're like, oh, but I got to practice this, but I got to practice that, and now I got this new lesson from Matt's website, I got to add that. Things are going to cycle in, things are going to cycle out. Try not to be too stagnant and try not to be changing things all the time, because then you're never really going to build a foundation. You're just going to toss yourself through a bunch of different ideas and ethos, and you're never really going to embed yourself into one. So it's got to be enough time that you're embedding yourself. And you know, if it's like a style, like, oh, I want to learn how to play hip-hop shit, it's like at least 3 months, bro. It's going to be at least 3 months before you know, that you're mainly focused on that. Percentage-wise, how much would you say you practice anything at comfort tempos as opposed to maxing out? I went over this earlier. 80% of the time, I'm operating between the 60 and 80% of my max. So that's kind of the comfort zone for me. And I do that 80% of the time, most of the time. And then 20% of the time is when I'm maxing out and pushing myself. And that's also important. So it's just kind of finding the balance of these things. He says, when working with the sticking pattern, do you find yourself permutating every conceivable accent placement, or is it more important to you to cherry pick where you deem the accents work best musically and concentrate more on permutating the pattern as a whole? Yeah, going through every single variation is tough and time consuming, but that is part of why I say make the initial upfront investment, because it usually takes some investigating to figure out, to cherry pick. You know, you can't just cherry pick on face value. You have to really spend time seeing if you can apply these patterns that you otherwise would have thrown out. Maybe they're useful. Maybe you find a use for them. So, yeah, man, I'm always cherry picking. I am. I'm a big fan of that, but you know, you got to go through the variations too. So, and then sometimes if you do the cherry picking process too early on, then you end up where you can't play that, you can't execute that pattern very well. And that's because it's only that one pattern, instead of having a foundation that it's built off of. You've got all these other patterns that are similar, and at the top is your favorite one. And that's actually what you're gonna play. So yeah, if you're only cherry picking, it can also limit your vocabulary. it can make you feel like, oh, I'm just playing the same crap all the time, because you come up with these stock riffs or these stock patterns, stock fills that come pre-packaged with accent patterns. And you can also limit your vocabulary. You can fall into that trap by constantly cherry picking, and for each category of patterns like flams, you only have like 3 that you've cherry picked. It's like, it's important to have a wealth of options so that they can intermingle. And it's kind of like, think about it like genetic diversity. You need a certain population to be able to mate with each other, right? That's basically what these patterns are doing, is they get jumbled in your brain and they make new patterns, and you're like, oh, I just came up with this out of nowhere. It's probably the marriage of 2 patterns. Isn't that just a beautiful analogy, guys? Beautiful stuff here at Matt Karsket Enterprises. That's what we do for you here, is we satisfy your soul. Well, I hope you guys gained some important insight from that and some ideas to utilize in your practice. And yeah, we're always trying to economize our practice, right? But at the end of the day, that's a whole process to figure out, and that takes time and energy and thought, psychic energy. It takes drive. It takes a lot. So at the end of the day, we're all drummers trying to push forward. So just remember that, man. And give your heart to this craft. Peace.